Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to poem number 12 of the 43 of Drum Taps, An Army Corps on the March. I want to remind you that very early on in Leaves of Grass that Whitman confided in his poem To Thee, O Cause, my book and the war are one. One of the things that we learn when we read the Drum Taps section is that there are a lot of different elements to this thing we call war. What we have said before, the new is the new, that is to say the NEW is the KNEW. And there are certain kinds of stages that war will inevitably go through. The first we've already experienced in our study in Drum Taps. That is to say, the coming to the mental ascendancy, the willingness to admit the cognitive dissonance that's involved in saying, fine, let's do this thing called war. And certainly we have several poems that will kind of play that game out. Now we're about to see a number of poems through the middle of Drum Taps. Many of these are more anthologized because these speak to what is the reality of the middle part of any kind of tripartite war situation. You always have the events before the conflict, you then obviously have the conflict, and then obviously you have the events after the conflict, and we'll get to more of that when we get to Memories of Lincoln here in a while. As we begin this project, though, I just want to remind you that our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff from the very first word come all the way up through the inscriptions. We gave a series of brief comments on Drum Taps, and we just finished with Bivouac. Bivouac poem. Now we're ready to move on. Let's work with some background information for just a moment here as we go to this one. This poem was first printed in the sequel to Drum Taps in 1865-66 and in 67, Drum Taps Annex under the title An Army on the March. The poem took its present title in 1871 when the final line, as the army resistless advances, was revised to the present reading. And we'll read it now to kind of see it. Now here again is a scene. Now some scholars believe that Whitman might actually have seen something like this when he was with Major Lynn Hapberg in 1863. It's a very brief poem, and again, it's one of those kind of photographic type of poems where he's just almost like taking a picture of a scene that he's seen. An Army Corps on the march. Think about on the march as being about the advancement in evolution that we will constantly be talking about when we do Leaves of Grass. With its cloud of skirmishers in advance, with now the sound of a single shot snapping like a whip, and now an irregular volley. The swarming ranks press on and on. The dense brigades press on. Glittering dimly, toiling under the sun, the dust-covered men in columns rise and fall to the undulations of the ground. With artillery interspersed, the wheels rumble, the horses sweat as the Army Corps advances. Now, I think that Leaves of Grass, as I've said to you guys a number of times, Leaves of Grass cannot be fully appreciated without a study of Homer and Virgil and Dante and Milton. I think, of course, Shakespeare obviously is a part of that as well. But I think for sure, here, we will see a lot of Homer and a lot of Virgil in a little poem like this. Let's take a look at how it works. Notice we begin, first of all, with this notion of the cloud of skirmishers. Now, readers of Whitman's day would have been immediately impressed with this idea of the cloud and being led by the cloud and a pillar of cloud, obviously from the Exodus story of the Old Testament. This idea of skirmishers will take us to the artilleryman's vision here in a while when we meet him. The skirmishers are now in advance. Notice the last word of the first line and the last word of the last line are both about advancement. So you can see in Whitman that he is trying to postulate that we are moving forward. With now the immediacy of so many of these poems, the sound, notice all the different senses that are being solicited in a poem like this. The sound of a single shot snapping, hear all these S-hard sibling sounds, like a whip. And now an irregular volley. In other words, we're in the middle of, or right beginning, a skirmish of some kind. The swarming ranks press on. You'll remember this word swarming from Centenarian's story. Ranks press on and on. The sense of a wave, it takes us back to the idea of the ocean in earlier poems. It obviously comes to mind. On the dense brigades pass on. This idea again of we're all packed together, these soldiers that are marching, dense brigades press on. Glittering dimly, it's an interesting phrase because early on in drum taps, you'll remember that we heard glitter and we heard shiny and we heard all this emphasizing of the ideas that, we got all this light and brightness, but now it's dimly, and then it's this toiling under the sun. Now, under the sun, of course, again, there's all kinds of biblical referencing going on here that Whitman's audience would have picked up with immediately. There's nothing new under the sun. Of course, it's the Ecclesiastes line. Under the sun, the dust-covered men, very much reminding us, of course, of a description maybe in Dante's Inferno. We've given full lectures, of course, on that at learnstrong.net. Go back and take a look at some of those images, and here we'll have something very similar. In other words, it's almost as if they're phantoms. It's like they're not really men. It's a powerful image for us. In columns, rise and fall. Notice on, rise and fall to the undulations. By the way, this is the only use of undulations in all of Leaves of Grass, of the ground, with artillery interspersed. So you've got men on the ground, you've got the weapons, you've got the explosions, and then notice the second dash here. The wheels rumble, so you're talking about what you can hear. The horses sweat. As we've said to you before, just go back and take a look at the way sweat gets used as a motif in Leaves of Grass as the Army Corps advances. Now, this notion of advancement for, I think, Whitman is proof positive of the positive element. Again, we call this a sustained theodicy, an explanation to try to explain why it is there's got to be pain, in this case war, suffering in the world. Why must there be all of this pain? Well, we're advancing. This is the nature of what we mean when we talk about civilization. At 2a, I think here that the idea of advancing is democracy can't be stopped. Even though it takes a war to do it, it cannot be stopped. At 2b, I like the word choices that are here, like beginning and ending with the idea of advance. At 3a, I mentioned Dante's Inferno already. It's interesting to just pick up Dante's Inferno and read it, and then to pick up the 43 poems of drum taps and just read them one right after the other. It's compelling to see kind of the imagery of both. Dante himself was always trying to capture those scenes, those specific scenes through Inferno. We're playing a very similar game here. Finally, at 3b, to own a poem like this one, do you believe that democracy will always advance in spite of even horrors like wars? My hope is that our study of drum taps will continue to challenge you to think about peaceful conflict of resolution. Thank you.